Well, as we've been discussing, the government has now finalised the position it wants to take to the Parliament on 18C, Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. It follows a party room meeting this morning which overwhelmingly supported the Cabinet position from from last night to take out the words offend, insult and humiliate from the Act, and instead keep intimidate and insert the word harass when it comes to racial vilification. Someone who has been campaigning for many years for this change, even before he entered Parliament, when he was still at the IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs, is James Paterson, now a Liberal Senator. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me, David.
So, are you happy with this change as far as you would like it to go?
Yes, I'm very happy with this change, but I think we should recognise that it is a compromise, because the only thing that would absolutely guarantee there would never be another QUT case or Bill Leak case is to repeal 18C in its entirety.
Would that be your preference?
I've said many times over the years that that's my preference, but I accept that this is a good and sensible compromise, so I'm happy to support it.
All right, so it will replace, as I say, offend, insult, humiliate with the words harass and
keep intimidate.
And keep intimidate. So what will that change?
Well, I think it will much better target the kind of racial abuse that no Australian wants to see. You know, from time to time it happens on a public bus, for example, and all Australians are appalled by that.
And that's currently targeted, isn't it?
It would be better targeted by harassment. It's very clear that that is harassing behaviour.
Isn't it offending and insulting as well?
Well, it may be, but I think harassment accurately captures it. And
so abusing someone on a bus over their race at the moment, you're saying right now you're not sure whether that's going to break 18C?
No, I'm not making a judgment whether it would or it wouldn't. I'm saying that the new law, it absolutely would breach it.
But you're not sure right now?
No, I'm not making a comment on what it does right now. I mean, there are state laws which are usually used to prosecute those matters, criminal state laws. So I don't think there's ever been an 18C case of a public bus harassment case. They always use state laws there. But this new 18C would definitely target it, but it would have the added advantage is that it would most likely never catch a cartoon again, or a journalist newspaper article, or students posting on Facebook, and that's a real advantage. It both better protects free speech and better targets racial abuse.
But those examples, like the Bill Leak cartoon, for example, do you agree that was a problem of process? Because in the end, it wasn't successfully prosecuted.
Well, it was a problem of process and law. I mean, Bill Leak could never have been taken to the Human Rights Commission if there wasn't a law like this. And the confidence Bill Leak and his lawyers had in defending themselves, both at the Commission and then subsequently in the courts, if it got that far, will be substantially enhanced by this new law. They'll be much more confident that a cartoon was never going to be
But the process change you've also announced would have knocked that out, right? Straight away, wouldn't it?
Well, it might have made it quicker, and this is particularly clear in the QUT case. That it probably would have been quicker, but I think it almost certainly still would have got to the courts, because you had a very determined litigant in this case who, even after losing in the first round of the courts...
QUT one, you mean?
Yeah, and even after losing and having costs awarded against her, she still appealed to the federal court and risked further costs. So I don't think anything we've done in the process would have stopped her doing that, but the changes we've made to the law will give those students confidence that they'll be able to defend themselves in court.
But are there any cases where there has been a successful prosecution under 18C that you say are problematic?
Well, I'm troubled by the Andrew Bolt judgment. I think that it is a worrying thing that in a free society, a journalist's article can be judged in the way it was by a court.
Because the judge's decision on that Andrew Bolt case, we're going back 5.5 years here to the piece that he wrote about a group of 9 Indigenous Australians, and the allegation was that he was inferring they were seeking professional advantage from the colour of their skin because they were Aboriginal. Justice Bromberg found that fair-skinned Aboriginal people were reasonably likely in all circumstances to have been offended, insulted, humiliated or intimidated by the imputations conveyed in the articles. So the judge was referring to some of the words you're keeping in the Act, intimidate in particular.
Yes, and so it is possible that that case would be decided in the same way, but there's another change to the law which may have impacted it. The judge found that a member of the affected community, in this case an Indigenous Australian, would think that it met the threshold of intimidation. We're now proposing to change that to a member of the general Australian community, not the affected community, because that has a degree of subjectivity to it. It's worrying that the standard that is being judged by is something that only applies to some Australians and not all Australians. So that would have a bearing on the case as well.
So that article, in your view, should be allowed to be written about fair-skinned Indigenous Australians using their Aboriginality to seek job promotion?
Well, without making any judgment on the merits of the article, I was troubled that we had a judge in a court deciding what can and can't be published or should or shouldn't be published in Australia. I think that's the judgment of editors and readers and our own good taste as Australians, not a judgment for the courts to be making.
But, you know, in this world where editors aren't always controlling what gets written online and social media and so on, you know, you don't always have those limitations these days of a responsible editor deciding these things. So you're saying that sort of comment should be allowed?
Well, it shouldn't. I don't think it should be unlawful. I don't think it should be punishable by the law. But there are other ways we deal with speech that we don't like, and there are many societies around the world who very effectively are able to shut down speech we don't want to see, and that's by public censure and criticism. And it's incumbent on all of us, myself included, to call out the kind of things that we don't want to see, whether it's caught by the law or not.
There have only been a handful of cases that have been successfully prosecuted under 18C, and the Andrew Bolt one is one of them, the most well-known. But some of the other, there's very few, as I say, but one of the other ones related to a 1999 complaint made after Senator Ross Lightfoot, one of your Liberal predecessors, made comments that Aboriginal people were the most primitive people on earth and that many aspects of Aboriginal culture were abhorrent. Should that be allowed to be said by, in this case, a senator?
Well, I think it's in very bad taste, and I would discourage people from saying things like that.
Should it be against the law?
No, I don't think it should be unlawful to say those things. I think it's up to us to call out things like that when we don't like to hear it.
Okay, but you don't think members of the affected group, in this case Indigenous Australians, might take a very different view?
They may well do, but and in living in a free society, sometimes that happens. Sometimes there are things said that we don't like to be said, and there will be things said that I don't like to be said, and I'll criticise it and I'll be vocal about it, but I don't think I should go to the courts to try and resolve that. So unless it is really way beyond the pale and it constitutes harassment or intimidation, where that's a real fear of a threat to yourself as a person. But
in this example, it should be legal, at least, to say that Aboriginal people are the most primitive people on earth, and many aspects of their culture are abhorrent.
Well, as I said, David, certainly not desirable, but I don't think it's a matter for the courts.
It should be legal.
Yes, I think it shouldn't be a matter for the courts, so by definition people should be able to say it, but they should be able to be criticised for saying it.
And what about characterising people of Asian background using what they might regard as offensive terms? Is that okay?
Well, again, I mean, we have to be very clear about what's not. I'm not saying that it's okay, but I'm saying it should generally not be a matter for the courts. If it's only offensive, if it is generally agreed that what the conduct is offensive, then I don't think that's sufficient grounds to limit free speech, because that's such a cornerstone of the free society that we live in. And I think actually the harmonious society that we live in, I think part of the reason we live in a harmonious society is generally we have protected free speech, and that's the best way to resolve these disputes.
And again, I mean, similarly, we can go down the list here, but people of Italian or Greek background, it's okay to offend them because of their racial background, but it shouldn't be illegal.
Well, offence is not a good enough reason on its own to make it unlawful for someone to say things.
And you can insult them by calling them, you know, I'm not going to use the phrases, but you can use those words, insult them, and that shouldn't be against the law.
Yeah, I don't think insults either are sufficient grounds to stop someone from exercising their free speech.
Do you concede that some of these groups are going to be scratching their heads about this and, you know, looking at someone like you who I assume hasn't faced a lot of racial abuse in your life, and nor have I, and thinking you don't really know what you're talking about here?
Sure, but there are people who have suffered racial abuse in their lives who came before our committee and said that they were in favour of changing the law. There are a lot of Indigenous advocates of change. There are a lot of Jewish advocates of change. There are people who've suffered awfully in their lives from discrimination who still nonetheless believe that freedom of speech is a really important principle and that it should be protected in a country like Australia.
But there are a lot of Indigenous and Jewish critics of what you're doing here, as you know, and you know, one of them is within your party. Julian Leeser, he's been very clear about this.
Yeah, I absolutely accept that, and I respect Julian greatly. He and I were on the committee together, and I think we worked really well together, and he comes from a very sincere place on this issue, and he made a very good argument for his position. But obviously I put a greater emphasis on the value of free speech than he does, and I think the line should be drawn in a different place that he does. But we all agree that the administration of 18C up until now has been woefully inadequate and it needs to be fixed.
Liberal Senator James Paterson, appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you very much for that. We're going to have more on 18C coming up. I want to go to the West, though, right now, because the former West Australian